Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 27 of the show. This past week has actually been pretty normal for me. Nothing crazy has happened in the past 7 days, although I am getting very excited for an upcoming interview I'm going to be doing for the show. Besides that, my life has consisted of work, sleep, and playing a bunch of different games. That leads well into feedback. If there are ever games which you feel would be perfect for the show, or you have questions or comments for me, don't be afraid to send those thoughts my way at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, I would love it if you took a minute to jump over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review. Those really go a long way toward making the show more visible. Let's transition now to this week's news. I feel like the same situation keeps coming up time and time again, but it still is fascinating to view from afar. In this past week, Nathan Grayson from Kotaku has written several articles about Metro Exodus. What's funny though is that these articles aren't about how cool the game looks or some news about some new enemy or mechanic. The news is about how it's going to be an Epic Game Store exclusive. For those of you not familiar, Exodus is the third installment in the Metro franchise, which is scheduled to release on February 15th. Apparently it's been up for pre-order on Steam, as would be expected, but on Monday the 28th of January, Valve posted a notice on the Metro Exodus Steam page saying the following. We think the decision to remove the game is unfair to Steam customers, especially after a long pre-sale period. We apologize to Steam customers that were expecting it to be available through the February 15th release date, but we were only recently informed of the decision and given limited time to let everyone know. So apparently a deal was done recently which is going to lock Steam out of that game for an entire year. There is word that Epic plans to honor all of those Steam pre-order sales, and Exodus is actually going to be selling for cheaper on the Epic Store. It's going to be $50 as opposed to $60. As you might imagine, the internet freaked out over this whole thing. There were review bombs on Steam for the other 2 Metro games, and angry people were even lashing out at Dmitry Glukovsky, hopefully I pronounced that right, who is the author of the books that the games are based off of. I love one quote that the Kotaku article brings up of him responding to someone saying that the deal was a bad decision. In response, Dmitry says, "Why? I think Epic will do everything to help, and I did not have an impression that Steam gives shit." Whether you're a fan of all this drama or not, it's going to be so interesting to see where all of this goes. I almost feel like I'm watching those robots from Pacific Rim fighting. The question is, who's going to wind up on top? Epic or Valve? In other news, did you hear about how cold it got in Chicago this past week? It was down to negative 23 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, with wind chills down to negative 50 degrees. But what's crazy is that the Chicago citizens probably felt cozy when compared to the citizens in today's game. This week's game is called Frostpunk. First of all, it needs to be mentioned that despite Golf Story being a good game, Sidebar really needs to take some notes here on how to come up with a badass name like Frostpunk. Frostpunk is a city builder survival game that was released on April 24th of 2018. It was developed by 11-Bit Studios, which was started in 2009 by some former CD Projekt and Metropolis software devs. They're based in Warsaw, Poland, and some games that they're best known for include Anomaly, Warzone Earth, Anomaly 2, and This War of Mine. Frostpunk currently costs $29.99 on Steam, and according to HowLongToBeat.com, the main story takes 9.5 hours to beat, and if you're a completionist, it can take upwards of 37.5 hours. I'm actually not confident in those numbers because a bunch of additional scenarios have been released rather recently, but whatever the case, there is a pretty substantial amount of gameplay for you to experience in this game. Frostpunk is exclusive to the PC and is definitely a game you would want to use a mouse and keyboard for. From what I can tell, it controlled incredibly well. You've left the frozen wasteland of London to find a new home. You were forced out, not by angry people, but by the cries of the dead telling you your fate. Instead of becoming a frozen corpse on the ground, you decide to lead a group of explorers to the north. You've heard rumors of an abundance of coal, and so you go. Despite being separated from the main group, your crew treks on and on until you find it. A gigantic heat generator in the middle of a sheltered crater. This is where you decide to build. Frostpunk starts out like no other city builder I've played. It's a beginning trodden with sadness, yet you can sense a small glimmer of possibility. Unlike games such as Civilization where you start out filled with hope and possibility, Frostpunk starts out with a much more bleak tone. Instead of being a race with endless possibilities ahead of you, you're a small troop of people living in a frozen dystopia, with enough supplies to last you only a few days. Before we get too far into the adventure, let's zoom out and gain an understanding of what caused this catastrophe. According to the trusty mage Wikipedia, Frostpunk is set in an alternate 1886 where a few events, including the eruptions of two mountains, the dimming of the sun, and a few additional factors, caused a worldwide volcanic winter. As can be imagined, this winter killed millions of crops and in turn killed millions of people trying to survive in frozen cities. In response to this worldwide winter, Britain built several generators in the coal-rich north just in case there was a massive migration from the south. This is where you come in. Although there are multiple scenarios in this game, we're just going to focus on the main one that you start out with, called A New Home. You play the primary character and leader of the group, and unlike many games where your character's personality and morality are decided before you start, Frostpunk forces you to consistently make decisions which give you as the player agency over what your character is like. The crux of the story is pretty simple. Your goal is to survive whatever comes your way. I'm going to be comparing this a lot to games like Civ because it twists that formula into something different and unique. Instead of building cities and amassing wealth in order to fight other nations, Frostpunk pushes you to build a city and stockpile resources in order to fight nature. You start out on a sunny, negative 20 degrees Celsius day, and as time goes on, the temperature just continues to drop and drop and drop. You're battling the cold, which brings along a plethora of challenges. Resources like logs are frozen over and require sawmills to cut. Your people are constantly susceptible to disease and frostbite, and in order to run half of your buildings and avoid becoming frozen piles of bones, you need to keep the generator running non-stop. Another interesting twist to Frostpunk is that despite constant pressure put on you by the weather, it's not your only adversary. One of the toughest challenges in this game is increasing hope and decreasing dissatisfaction in your people. A person who has no will to follow or live is worse off for you than someone who's dead. At least a dead person doesn't eat your food or threaten to throw you out into the wasteland. The leadership and management portion of Frostpunk is really where the narrative shines. City builders can often become all about the mechanics, but this game is very different. You as the leader not only have the task to provide shelter, heat, and food, you're tasked to keep the peace and make incredibly tough moral decisions. Should you enact a law that forces children to work, or should you choose to give them shelter? Although that might seem like an easy choice, when you look at the repercussions of each, the gray area becomes much larger. Although parents won't like it, when you put kids to work, your workforce increases tremendously, giving you a chance to boost your economy before the weather takes a nosedive. Is it really unethical in a life or death situation? On the other hand, you can build a children's shelter, and although it will cost you a lot of resources up front, maybe the hope gained and eventually child apprentices will make it worth it. You as the player are constantly faced with decisions just like this. Should you build a church or a watchtower? Should you build a cemetery or throw the bodies in a pit? Should you research improved housing or a more efficient way to collect resources? Unlike many other city builders, Frostpunk led me to connect deeply with the narrative. You aren't some nation's hero that will lead your armies to victory. You're just a person who needs to bring hope to the hopeless and make decisions which often hurt someone no matter what you decide. The narrative is really foundational to Frostpunk. The somber and desolate feelings I had from the beginning really affected how I played, and they made me want to push forward and fight harder through the cold. Of course, this game still is systems driven, and if you want to min-max your way through everything, including the moral decisions, you can, but the raw experience you get starting out in this game is incredible. Let's look now into the gameplay of Frostpunk. There are a few standout mechanics that I want to talk about. I'm not a city builder expert by any means, but I've played my fair share of them, and the survival aspect of Frostpunk is truly unique. Generally, in those types of games, there are issues that arise, but it doesn't normally feel like you're fighting against scarcity of resources or extreme weather. In Frostpunk, you're just trying to stay afloat, as opposed to many other games where you're actually trying to increase efficiency as your main goal. The survival aspect added weight to all of the decisions I made. I kept having the words opportunity cost bounce around in my head as I had flashbacks to economics in college. I could decide to build 4 tents to get 40 of my people out of the cold, but could those resources and time be spent better on, say, building a sawmill? You're constantly faced with decisions which improve one resource and hurt another. Let's talk some specifics. The primary physical resources you're going to be managing are wood, coal, steel, raw food, and food rations. As you progress, there will be other resources to manage, including steam cores and prosthetics, but they're secondary to the rest. Luckily, you start out with some steel wreckage, wooden boxes, and coal piles nearby that you can salvage from, but you quickly realize that those aren't going to last. Although the beginning is the warmest, your initial decisions can have a huge impact on how quickly you get your engine running, and also what sort of impact that has on your people. That brings us to the more human side of the survival. You not only need to manage the hope and ominous dissatisfaction bars at the bottom of your screen, you also need to manage the sick, hungry, and homeless. If a person is homeless, they're more likely to be sick and discontented. If a person is sick, they're more likely to die, and even if they don't die, they'll be absent from work, thus lessening your economic efficiency. Your decisions also play a huge role in the human resources aspects of the game, but before we get into that, let's talk about some more of the city building. Just like most other city builders, you start out with a pretty narrow array of buildings to construct, but as you progress through your run and research additional locations, you have more and more options. That's not all that unique, but what is fascinating is the orientation of your city. If you remember from our discussion of the narrative, your crew found a gigantic generator in the middle of a crater. And that is key because the generator is the source of heat and power for many of your buildings. As such, your entire city is built in a circle around that generator, and the placement of your roads and buildings really matter because of those factors. Some of your buildings, like your medical centers and homes, really need to have that additional heat, and if you don't place them close to your generator, you better turn on those heaters or put some steam hubs nearby. The beginning of the game starts out relatively warm, but once I started hitting day 20 and beyond, the heat became increasingly important. Although there isn't a counter of how you're doing in terms of warmth, that is one of the most crucial elements to your survival. If your generator stops, you can't provide sufficient heat, people may get sick, many jobs are shut down, medical centers stop, and your city is in a standstill. Let's touch now on an aspect of the game we mentioned earlier, your moral decisions. From nearly the beginning, you have a cooldown ability which allows you to enact laws. You can force kids to work, allow duels, permit amputations, and so much more. Many of the decisions have immediate and long-term positives and or negatives. For example, if you enact a law which allows a fighting ring, hope rises, but you need to build that fighting ring in a certain amount of time or it will cost you dearly. As you get further on in the run, you also get the choice to pursue an order or faith route with your people. Do you want to rule with an iron fist and give your people a sense of safety even if they aren't enjoying life all that much? Or do you want to rule with religion and try to calm people down with peace and hopefulness? Although your political decisions can have lasting impacts on your society, you often have to make more frequent decisions based on complaints from your people. Maybe the homeless are crying out that you pay attention to them. You might then have three choices. Do you want to provide housing for 30 of them? Do you want to provide quality housing for 30 of them? Or do you just want to ignore the problem? Your decisions in situations like this often will create many objectives that are incredibly important for you to follow through on. If you decide to ignore a problem, it usually has an immediate impact on both dissatisfaction and hope. But for example, if you promise to house the 30 people, your hope might increase slightly. However, you then have a timer that pops up. If you provide housing before it runs out, hope will probably rise again. You're a good leader and you're true to your promises. But if you end up shifting plans and ignoring that promise, it will cost you dearly. I found that Frostpunk used these situations both as a way to remind you to build houses or medical centers and as a way to add more tension to the game. If you keep ignoring the homeless pleas for shelter and better housing, it will eventually catch up with you and will be devastating. The last aspect of the game I want to mention is exploration. This is a seemingly small but very important part of the game to participate in. Once you build the beacon, you have the option to send out a scout team to look around. It costs you workers and resources to scout, but this is the primary way you're going to find things like automatons and more people. The way this mechanic works is actually a lot like a text-based adventure. You choose one of a few locations for your scouts to go, you wait however many hours and days it takes them to get there, and once they're there, you usually choose what they do. Maybe you find some survivors and resources. Do you want to escort them back to your city? Do you want to send them on their own to your city? Or do you want to rob them of their resources and ditch them? In addition to these decisions that you'll be making, there are also additional story elements and lore that you can uncover and read about in the Scout's Journal. This aspect of the game, although simple, helped me as the player gain some hope myself. It was easy to get in the rut of micromanaging my city and watching my population slowly decrease in size, despite my best efforts to care for the people and increase efficiency. Sending out scouts gave me hope and excitement, especially when they found more survivors and resources that I could use. Overall, you might be thinking that Frostpunk sounds incredibly bleak and brutal, and you would be right. However, it's important to convey that this game is incredibly fun as well. The gameplay is challenging, and Frostpunk introduces some unique mechanics to the genre. Last but certainly not least, how is the art and sound design? Both are incredible. The art actually reminded me of a darker version of the board game Scythe, kinda combined with the look of the Snowpiercer movie. There are a lot of grays and blacks, which contrasts nicely with the fire spitting out of your generator, and the actual steampunk content looks so cool. The art is crisp and so nice to look at. In my mind, I was comparing it a lot to the much more cartoony look of Civ 6. Frostpunk not only feels much more raw, the art falls in line with the tone and looks more realistic and dark. I actually like the UI, the user interface as well. For many of these games, it's easy for developers to clog your visuals with hundreds of icons and tips. In my opinion, 11-bit studios did a nice job of showing important details without overloading you visually. In terms of the sound design for this game, the soundtrack is superb. It's full of gorgeous and emotional orchestral pieces. There's lots of deep and ominous melodies from the cello and somber sounds from the violins. As I was listening to it, it was making my hair stand up. The music fit perfectly with the tone, art, and narrative of this story, and when it came to all of the sound effects like generators running, and hammers clinking, and steam-powered engines starting, I was thoroughly impressed. If I looked hard enough, I'm sure I could find something to complain about, but in the time that I played, I couldn't find a single thing related to the art or sound design that truly bothered me. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design of Frostpunk, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, this game did an excellent job of incorporating strong narrative elements into a city builder. The game did a great job of investing me in the story through the survival, as well as through all of the moral decisions I had to make. Second, the gameplay was solid. There is a learning curve, but it wasn't so tough that I wanted to give up, and there was a nice depth of play to the mechanics. At least for the main scenario, there was a good ebb and flow as well. The gameplay was challenging, but it didn't feel like it was consistently pedal to the metal. There were bits of time where I could prepare for the next disaster instead of always feeling like I was on the back foot. Third, the art and sound design fit Frostpunk wonderfully. It contributed to the theme of despair with a sliver of hope, and the actual quality of art and sound design was incredible. On the negative side, there really isn't a lot here. One downside I see is that replayability isn't quite as appealing as a game like Civ 6. In Civ, a lot changes when you choose a different race, but once you play through a scenario in Frostpunk, you see most of what there is to see. I'm going to counter my point though with a couple things that you should keep in mind. First of all, this game costs half as much as Civ 6 and isn't the same game at all despite some similarities. Second, 11-bit studios have added 3 additional scenarios on top of the first, and they've added an endless mode. In the grand scheme of things, if you enjoy the base gameplay of Frostpunk, there is plenty of content for you to dive into. My second complaint is less of a complaint and more of an improvement that I could see. I would have actually enjoyed seeing some additional specific character development in the game. As I've mentioned already, I'm very impressed with the narrative, especially for a city builder, but now that I've gotten a taste for a great narrative in this type of game, I want even more. I would have loved it if they had presented some relationship scenarios where you aren't just managing large groups as a whole, but you're also managing interactions with a spouse or foreman or whoever it might be. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. This is another one of those titles that makes a case for being a work of art. It's a beautiful, albeit grim experience that really elevates the city building genre by weaving in strong narrative, survival, and moral elements. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen in. In case you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you use, and look me up on Instagram and Facebook at klutchkittengaming. I hope you have a chill rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.